This is a loaf of sourdough bread made with 100% whole grain spelt flour. It's crispy and crunchy on the outside, and the inside is full of whole grain goodness. Here's how to make it. In the evening before you go to bed, take 25 grams of sourdough starter out of your fridge. Then feed your starter 50 grams of water and 50 grams of 100% whole grain spelt flour. It doesn't really matter what type of starter you keep in the fridge. Mine is usually maintained with white bread flour, but if yours is rye or spelt, whatever it is, for this recipe, feed your starter 50 grams of water and 50 grams of spelt flour, and you'll have a beautiful whole grain spelt sourdough starter the next day. So stir the starter up, mark the top of the starter with a rubber band, and then let it sit on the counter overnight or for at least 8 hours until it doubles in size and looks like this. Then it's ready to use. To make your dough, get out a mixing bowl and put it on your kitchen scale, and then add 275 grams of water to that mixing bowl. Once you've got the 275 grams weighed out, add 10 grams of salt to the mixing bowl. I use kosher salt, but any kind of plain table salt or sea salt will work fine as well. Now get out your risen and active spelt sourdough starter and add 100 grams of starter to the mixing bowl. This should leave you with about 25 grams of starter left over. You can just keep that in the fridge for the next time you're ready to bake, and you can feed it with whatever flour you're using for your next recipe. Stir all of the liquid ingredients together to dissolve the salt and the sourdough starter into the water. Then once those are fairly well dissolved, add 450 grams of whole grain spelt flour to the rest of the ingredients. One note on the flour is that I've seen white spelt flours out there in the world, but I definitely recommend using whole grain spelt flour for this recipe. White spelt flour tends to act very differently than whole grain spelt flour does, so you will definitely not get the same result as I get in this video. With that being said, go ahead and mix this thick whole grain sourdough dough together until most of those dry clumps of flour disappear into the dough mass. This should take just about a minute or two of mixing with a spoon. And when you're dough, you should be able to pick the dough up. It'll feel tacky to the touch. It's definitely a lower hydration dough, so the dough will hold together fairly well when you lift it up out of the bowl like this. At this point, place the dough back into the mixing bowl and cover the bowl up with a kitchen towel or some kind of airtight lid and let the dough rest on the counter for 30 minutes. A half hour later, you're going to start the stretch and fold process. You're going to be doing 3 sets of stretch and folds with a half hour in between each set. So start by grabbing an edge of the dough, lifting it up into the air, and folding it over the top of the dough. Give the bowl a quarter turn, then stretch the other end up and fold it over the top. Another quarter turn, stretch the dough up. You'll notice that it's holding together really well and kind of resisting the stretching, but just stretch each corner up, fold it over, until you've given the dough 4 stretches on the north, east, south, and west ends of the dough. If you're not used to the stretch and fold process, the main purpose is to develop gluten in the dough. It's essentially a replacement for kneading, but it's a more delicate process that retains more of the air in the dough as you stretch and fold. At this point, cover up the dough, let it rest for another 30 minutes, then do your second set of stretch and folds. This time it should be a little bit easier than the first time and the dough will hold together better. Give the dough 4 folds on the north, east, south, and west ends of the dough, then cover it up again with a kitchen towel and let it rest for another 30 minutes. A half hour later, give the dough its third and final set of stretch and folds, stretching it on the north, south, east, and west sides of the dough. And now it's time to let the dough go through its first rise or the bulk fermentation. You could let the dough rise directly in the same mixing bowl, but I've got a glass bowl here that I've greased with a little bit of olive oil. I'm going to do my bulk fermentation in this container today. So flip the dough over so it's got the smooth side facing up and the seam side facing down. Then place the airtight lid back on the bowl. I really like using these glass bowls often because 1, it has an airtight lid, and 2, it lets me see how much the dough is rising through the glass. Let your dough rise for 6 to 8 hours or until it has filled out the bowl like this and doubled in size. Then it's ready to shape. For the pre-shape, gently remove the risen dough from the sides of the glass bowl, moving around the bowl with your fingertips and just loosening the dough from the bowl. Then flip the dough out onto the counter with the smooth side up and the seam side down. Then cup and pull the dough with your hands like this, creating tension across the dough and forming the dough into a tight ball. Let it rest on the counter uncovered for 15 to 30 minutes, and then you're going to move on to the final shape step. For that, I've got a round 10-inch Banneton basket here that I've dusted with spelt flour, and then I'm going to dust the top of the dough with spelt flour as well, just to create a non-stick barrier. To shape the dough into a round boule, just do the same thing you did for the pre-shape. Cup and pull the dough with your hands to create tension going across the top of the dough until the dough is once again a tight ball of dough, but this time it's been dusted with flour and it's ready to go in the Banneton basket. So flip the dough over so the seam side is now facing up and the smooth floured side is facing down against the ridges of the Banneton basket. Now the dough is ready for its second rise or the final proof. If you want to bake the bread today, simply cover up the Banneton basket with a kitchen towel and let it rise at room temperature for 2 to 3 hours. Then it'll be ready to bake, or you can move it to your refrigerator and let it sit for 8 to 24 hours, basically until whenever you want to bake it the next day. This will build extra flavor in the dough as it goes through a long, cold fermentation. Then the next day, preheat your oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit and make sure you've got a Dutch oven inside of the oven preheating along with it. I recommend having your Dutch oven or Challenger bread pan on the middle rack with some kind of metal baking sheet or pizza stone underneath. That'll help prevent the bottom of the bread from burning. Now once your oven is preheated for 30 minutes, take the dough out of the fridge. It should still be very cold, but you can bake it directly from the fridge like this. There's no need to let it come up to room temperature. Take a piece of parchment paper that's a little bit larger than your dough and place it on top of the dough. Then flip the dough over so the parchment paper is underneath. Now your dough is facing right side up and it's ready to score. Brush off any excess spelt flour that's on top of the dough if there is any, then get out your razor blade or bread lame in order to score the dough. The one I'm using today is the Baker of Seville bread lame. You could use any kind of lame that you want, but preferably one that has a straight blade. The scoring pattern that I like to do for this loaf is the same one I do for most circular loaves, and that's just a simple cross pattern. Just make one straight line straight down the middle of the dough, and then make another straight line that's perpendicular to the first one, crossing right through the middle. During the first half of the baking time, when the bread is rising and it's got that oven spring, the dough should burst open along this score mark beautifully. Since your oven is hot, it's been preheating for a half hour, take the whole loaf, parchment paper and all, and transfer it into your Dutch oven. Place the lid on top to trap the steam, and it's ready to bake. Bake this for an initial 20 minutes at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. After the 20 minutes is up, remove the lid, release that steam, and admire your oven spring. If everything went according to plan, the bread should have burst open along that score mark like this, and it's ready to continue baking. Bake this for an additional 15 to 20 minutes or until the bread has the dark brown color that you're looking for. This is what my bread looked like after an additional 15 minutes of baking. Take your bread out of the oven and place it onto a cooling rack and let it rest for at least an hour before you slice in. As far as appearances go, I think this is a beautiful whole grain loaf of sourdough bread. The spelt flour really gives the bread a dark brown hue, and it's crispy and crunchy on the outside. Now let's see what it looks like on the inside and take a taste test. The first thing you might notice is that this loaf is not light and airy and full of holes like other loaves of sourdough bread that you might be familiar with. The closed crumb nature of this bread may make it look kind of dense, but trust me, it is not dense. It might be a hearty whole grain loaf, but it is light and full of air. Cutting off a slice here, you'll get to see just how tender this loaf of bread is. The crispy, crunchy crust holds everything together on the outside, but the inside of the bread basically falls apart. It is so tender and delicious. As for the taste, this bread is very nutty and malty. If you like those kind of words to describe your food, you are going to love this whole grain spelt sourdough bread. It's great to eat toasted with butter, as I think the sweetness that toasting bread brings out really complements the nutty and malty flavors very well. And as is my habit lately, I enjoy this bread with a slather of tangy jam on top. I'd highly recommend eating this bread with your favorite jam or jelly. But however you enjoy it, I do hope you make this bread soon. I'll include a link in the video description below to the written recipe, as well as a few links to some of the tools that I use to make this bread. So go check those links out, and I'll see you in the next video.